Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fellows Alum Reading Series at the Hutchins Center. So today we are excited to have Kaysha Corinealdi, who was a fellow last year. She is Assistant Professor of History at Emerson College. Her research and teaching interests include 20th century histories of empire, migration, feminism, and Afro-diasporic activism in the Americas. Her book, Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World-Making in the 20th Century, published by Duke University Press in 2022, centers the activism of Afro-Caribbean migrants and their descendants as they navigated practices and policies of anti-Blackness, xenophobia, denationalization, and white supremacy in Panama and in the US. A prolific author, her scholarship has recently appeared in such important publications in her fields of specialization, such as Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and the International Journal of Africana Studies. We're happy also to welcome Natanya Duncan as our discussant. She is Director of Africana Studies at Queens College, City University of New York, and an Associate Professor of History there. An historian of the African diaspora, her research and teaching focuses on global freedom movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. Her research interests include constructions of identity and nation building amongst women of color, migrations, color and class and diasporic communities, and the engagements of intellectuals throughout the African diaspora. Her book, An Efficient Womanhood, Women and the Making of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, is forthcoming in 2023 from the University of Illinois Press. She's also a prolific scholar, and her most recent publication is a special co-edited volume of Caribbean Women and the Caribbean Women and Gender Studies Journal entitled Gender and Anti-Colonialism in the Interwar Caribbean. Welcome, Professors Corinealdi and Duncan.
Well, thank you all for being with us here in this virtual space, and my thanks to Krishna, Tom, and the entire Hutchins team for just putting this together. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about the book now that it's out and about in the world. And so what we have planned to do is a reading, but prior to that, I wanted to offer a little bit of context in terms of the book as a whole, because I'll be reading from the last chapter of the book, and I wanted to sort of place that in conversation with what comes before it. So the book, as was mentioned by Krishna, really looks at activism by Afro-Caribbean Panamanians, particularly Black Panamanians whose parents were born in the Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean, many of whom were in one way involved with some of the major projects in Panama, from the railroad to banana cultivation to the French and then later US building or attempted building in the French case and building of the canal in the US case. And what I focus on is what happens after the canal is built. What are the kinds of lives and actions that these particular children of migrants are able to undertake in Panama and eventually in New York, which is sort of the latter parts of the book. So the book really tries to think about how can an exploration of Black activism through the lens of Afro-Caribbean Panamanians expand the way that we usually think about Panamanian history, about US history, and Black diaspora history. And so in the context of Panamanian history, as I said, I really wanted to focus attention on the period after the construction of the canal, right? What were the lives that people had to undertake? And in particular, I wanted to focus on the rise in xenophobic laws that were presented starting in the 20s and all the way into the 40s, and the ways that Afro-Caribbean Panamanians created civic associations. They sometimes sought laws, petition campaigns, And often also the idea of being able to move, whether that is within and within different spaces in Panama, from the Republic to the Canal Zone to eventually leaving Panama as well. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about what that history of nation building looked like in the context of a nation that was quite young in terms of gaining its independence in 1903 and really kind of having a model of nation building that centered this notion of an Iberian nation in Central America that didn't really coincide with the people in the space. I also wanted to expand how we think about US history in first thinking about US as an empire and the way in which the Canal Zone became one clear manifestation of this presence, but also the way that most people think about this space, the Canal Zone, as it being a space inhabited by white US citizens, and ignoring that for decades, Black people, and particularly Afro-Caribbean Panamanians, were the majority living in this space and creating community, doing so under really disadvantaged conditions of segregation, discrimination, but really creating flourishing communities. And so I talk about that in particular in sort of chapters 2 and chapters 3 of the text as well. I also wanted to expand thinking about US history in the context of Black migration in the US and really placing the migration of Black Panamanians in conversation with that of other Black migrants from throughout the Caribbean and the Americas in New York, but also sort of the Great Migration in the context of the US, where you have African Americans who've made their way to places like New York City, and how Brooklyn in particular becomes this really robust space to imagine making new worlds. So the idea of world making and how migrants and their descendants play a pivotal role in not only bringing about the modernity that many countries rely on in terms of basic things like railroads or canals, et cetera, to really thinking about how their very lives and their experiences shape how we understand these nations, is really at the core of the book as a whole. And so I take throughout the book a focus on particular people, particular associations, particular events, to really try to make this a history that is not less about who were these people and what happened to them, but rather how did they narrate their own life histories and how did they experience and understand what being agents of the world was all about. And this is where Las Servidoras, the subject, right, of this last chapter, really comes into fore, in that it is a group of Black women who were born and raised in Panama, who also shared this history of having parents or grandparents who were among the canal builders or those who helped to maintain the canal, who experienced xenophobia and segregation in the Panamanian Republic and in the Canal Zone, and who, coming to Brooklyn, also then found themselves experiencing segregation in terms of schooling, in terms of housing, et cetera. And so I look at the sort of trajectory of the organization beginning in the 50s and really ending in the early 1970s to paint a picture about the kind of work that these women really pioneered and how it really allowed for thinking of world making in a concrete way as how do you place it, and have it developed in Panama and the Canal Zone and then expanded further in New York, so that you essentially have Panama in New York by the 40s and 50s. So I wanted to give just a bit of that context before jumping into reading a section of chapter 5, Panama in New York. And then after that, we'll sort of have Professor Duncan be in conversation with me, and then leave some time, of course, for those of you who want to ask some questions about it as well. So I'm going to read it for a bit here. Gendering honors, activism, and leadership. The group's third and fourth spring luncheons in 1968 and 1970 addressed unfolding questions of multiple national histories and communal progress. The 1968 luncheon combined 3 of the major histories that informed the group's trajectory: the Afro-Caribbean experience in Panama, the growing presence of the US-born generation, and the continued search for adequate representation of the goals and achievements of Black women, especially Afro-Caribbean Panamanian women. The 1970 luncheon, by showcasing the achievements of a particular Afro-Caribbean Panamanian women, explicitly engaged as third history. Las Servidoras, through their choice of honorees and guests, also used these luncheons to depict how the histories of Panama and New York and Afro-diasporic political thought intertwined. The June 1968 luncheon paid tribute to George W. Westerman and Alvin K. Wilkes. Westerman's activism was familiar to New York Afro-Caribbean Panamanians. Principal editor for the Panama Tribune since 1959, he had often commented on this community. Between 1956 and 1960, he also spent time in New York as Panama's UN ambassador. The second luncheon honoree, Wilkes, a native of Missouri, was the first non-Panamanian to receive an honor from the group. He came to the attention of the organization through his assistance in the choreography and general arrangements for the cotillions, and this was one of the events coordinated by the association. Wilkes was also the director of recreation and cultural affairs for the New York City Youth Board. The two honorees came from different backgrounds. Westerman, through the Tribune, the Panama Tribune, which I talk about in the first chapter, had kept the public in Panama informed about the affairs of the group. In 1963 and 1967, he had purchased full-page ads on behalf of the Tribune in the group's commemorative journals. Wilkes, as the male choreographer for the 1965 and 1967 cotillions, had worked alongside the members of Las Servidoras Cotillion Committee. Honoring them highlighted the achievements of two prominent Black men, one with roots in Panama and the other with roots in Missouri and New York. Their presence also gave Las Servidoras an opportunity to acknowledge two public supporters. Given Westerman's international and community fame, Las Servidoras could count on a good turnout from the general Panamanian community in New York. Wilkes's presence could also encourage the attendance of other city officials and African Americans interested in organizations working with New York City youth. A big turnout for the event would increase monies for the scholarship fund. The group Las Servidoras was founded to raise scholarship monies for Black Panamanians and eventually Black students as a whole in New York City. This honoring of a prominent Panamanian and a US citizen came at a time of tense relations between both countries. 4 years earlier, the Panamanian government had ended diplomatic relations with the United States following the deaths of 22 Panamanian protesters, including Afro-Caribbean Panamanian youths, at the hands of the Canal Zone police and US military. Protesters had been demanding that the Panamanian flag be flown in the Canal Zone along the US flag at 15 specific sites as agreed to in the 1963 Kennedy-Shadid Accord. US students at Bois High School in the zone, not one of the designated sites, flew their flag without the Panamanian flag beside it, which led to a confrontation between US and Panamanian students, the latter from the nearby Instituto Nacional. This flag conflict between rival groups of students centered on who held sovereignty in the zone and sparked the January 1964 popular uprising as it spread to the neighborhoods of El Chorrillo and Colón. Diplomatic relations resumed between both nations 6 months later, but they remained strained, and the issue of sovereignty over the Canal Zone would lead to two new sets of canal treaty discussions, one starting in 1964 and the other in 1971. Honoring Westerman as someone who had worked as a journalist and a diplomat on canal matters since the 1940s offered hope for a new diplomatic future between the two nations. Wilkes, in turn, represented the kind of solidarity that US citizens could offer their fellow Black allies in the United States and throughout the diaspora. His work with young people highlighted the necessity to think of future generations and the promises of young Black potential. About 500 people attended the luncheon. Clearly, Las Servidoras remained alert entrepreneurs 15 years into the group's establishment. The decision to honor two men nonetheless raised the question of the place of women honorees in the organization's events. Both Westerman and Wilkes had done great work throughout the years, and honoring them made strategic sense, but where were the women? The first cotillion and luncheon had honored men of the community. The second luncheon now honored two men. Were there no women in either Panama or the United States that the group wished to recognize? A review of the commemorative journal created for the 1968 luncheon offers some answers. The journal revealed the tensions between women organizing as leaders and the continued use of race pride agendas centered on manhood. This focus on men as the vectors of racial pride had a long and deep-rooted history in the context of Afro-Caribbean Panamanian experiences as far back as the creation of the Panama Tribune and its presentation of male editors as the only legitimate representatives of the community. The luncheon journal, along with providing information on the male honorees, featured a brief presidential address and details on a guest speaker that reflected awareness within the group of the peculiar nature of honoring two men and no women. Lurleen Johnson, the group's president at the time, devoted most of her address to thanking all those involved in making the luncheon and the organization a success. She extended her congratulations to the event's two honorees. Johnson ended her comments, though, by quoting Mary McAleod Bethune's last will and testament. Bethune, prior to her death in 1955, had founded the Bethune-Cookman School in Florida, and by 1935 had created the National Council of Negro Women in New York. A former teacher in Panama, Johnson set out the words of another Black woman born in an earlier century and in another part of the Americas to express her final thoughts on the power of education and enlightened leadership. I leave you a thirst for education. I leave you a respect for the use of power. I leave you faith. I leave you racial dignity. I leave you desire to live harmoniously with your fellow men. I leave you finally a responsibility to our young people. These verses coincided with the mission of Las Servidoras. Education, faith, dignity, and serving young people were foremost on the organization's agenda. The organization represented women living harmoniously with one another, but the presence of foundational racism remained unquestioned. Progress remained centered on brotherhood and fraternity, making it difficult to celebrate women without first invoking men. The presence of Shirley Chisholm as a guest speaker at the 1968 luncheon indicated an attempt by Las Servidoras to go beyond a male-centered race pride agenda. Chisholm, a passionate educator and later New York Assemblywoman, had received the kind of academic training most of the women in the group had been unable to access. She had a BA from Brooklyn College and an MA in early childhood education from Columbia University. Chisholm was also a generation younger than the leaders of Las Servidoras, but like them, had connections to the Caribbean. Though born in New York, Chisholm received her elementary education in Barbados. Given the number of people in Panama with Asian roots or ancestors, tapping Chisholm as guest speaker was especially meaningful. Barbados gained its independence as a Black nation in 1966. Its post-colonial future was of great interest to Asians and other Caribbean descendants throughout the diaspora. Politics also factored into Chisholm's participation. Many attendees lived in the Brooklyn district she represented. Their votes could seal her congressional victory. By asking Chisholm to speak at the luncheon, Las Servidoras showcased their political acumen. In her speech, Chisholm focused on education debates, especially around community control of schools, and invoked the importance of engagement and activism to solve the political problems of the city. With Chisholm's presence, Las Servidoras gestured to the bright futures that awaited scholarship recipients. 6 Black women awardees benefited from the proceeds of the luncheon. Writing to the group in 1970, Barbara Gardner expressed her deep thanks to Las Servidoras. Quote, "My 4 years at American University have meant a great deal to me. I will never forget how instrumental members of Club Las Servidoras have been in making it possible. On behalf of me, of myself and my family, I would again like to express my thanks." Through her scholarship, Gardner sent the group updates on her work in the Black Student Union, her volunteer service with children in Southeast Washington, DC, her chartering of a women's sorority devoted to international service, and her work in the Decent Housing Federal Community Program. She also made note of plans to enroll in a master's program in international service and continue work with federal agencies on international development. Gardner not only succeeded, but thrived as a Las Servidoras Scholarship recipient. Marsha Bain Smith, a 1967 to 70 scholarship recipient, credited Las Servidoras for her formation as an activist and a scholar. She was working in Panama City and attending classes in a newly built Canal Zone Junior College constructed in La Boca when she learned of Las Servidoras. La Boca had been converted to a US rate community, a blow to the thriving Afro-Caribbean community there, but the college remained open to tuition-paying US and Panamanian citizens. And I talk a lot about La Boca in particularly chapters 2 and 4 of the book. This concession, the college, allowed zone officials to comply with school desegregation mandates while generating a profit when the Canal Zone no longer received US federal assistance. On attending the college and connecting with Las Servidoras, Bain Smith recalls, I had no money to go to school full-time, and I was working in the daytime. It had taken me 2.5 years to accumulate 1 year of credits. The Las Servidoras founder and her family were all friends of my family back in Panama, so I knew of their work and applied for a scholarship. I completed my SATs in Panama, and once I got into school and got scholarships, I then moved to New York. I met regularly with the scholarship committee, and they were constantly in touch with the school and paid the school directly. It was not just about the money. They, Las Servidoras, gave me a lot of emotional support and spiritual guidance. After completing college and graduate school, Bain Smith worked as a social worker. Many of the adults and families she assisted were migrants of the post-1965 period. As a migrant Black woman and bilingual speaker, she had a particular connection to the people she served. Eventually, her frustration at, quote, implementing policies that were created by people who did not have a clue about the communities they were servicing, end quote, pushed Bain Smith to start her own organization targeted at the needs of Caribbean women in New York, the Caribbean Women's Health Association, and begin a doctoral program in social work. In Las Servidoras' efforts to inspire a new generation of scholarship awardees, they also paid tribute to Leonor Jump Watson and Waldaba Stewart. By offering a 2-page biography on Jump Watson, the group gave their honoree the kind of recognition that she had not received in either Panama or the United States. Her life in many ways paralleled the values and aspirations of the women who 17 years prior had founded Las Servidoras. Like them, she also viewed the start of the 1970s as an opportunity to engage with the next generation of leaders. In her acceptance speech, Jump Watson raised this very issue. As a community organization, Las Servidoras has done a remarkable job in stimulating and helping young people attain their goals of higher education by providing substantial scholarships. And it has helped them to improve their personal and social images by sponsoring elegant debutante activities. But a greater challenge, perhaps, imposes itself at this crucial time: how to work with young people in improving the quality of life, not only for themselves, but for others less fortunate in their communities. By also honoring New York State Senator Waldaba H. Stewart at the 1970 luncheon, Las Servidoras offered one possible suggestion to this younger generation. Stewart, who was Jump Watson's junior by 2 decades, also had roots in Panama, the Canal Zone, and New York. Born in Panama City, he received the bulk of his education in the Canal Zone. His father, a reverend, still lived in Panama City. Before becoming a state senator in 1968, Stewart had taught at the New York City public school system and later joined Bedford-Stuyvesant Youth in Action, a federally funded anti-poverty program. He served as an associate director for the program between 1966 and 1968. Stewart's presence at the luncheon, with that of 2 other politicians of color, State Assemblyman Thomas Fortune and State Senator Basil A. Patterson, was tied to a new political wave sweeping through New York in the late 1960s. All 3 men had roots in the Caribbean, although Stewart was the only one born outside of the United States. Along with women like Chisholm, they represented a civil rights generation of Black migrants and their descendants who were reshaping the cultural and political landscape of New York. The honors bestowed on Jump Watson and Stewart by Las Servidoras pointed to another phase of Afro-Caribbean diasporic formation. This phase comprised an engagement with education-centered civil rights struggles and electoral debates in New York, as well as the centrality of women in making the Black diasporic histories of Panama and New York visible to thousands. The existence of Las Servidoras showed how independent cohorts of Afro-Caribbean Panamanians could start other organizations that simultaneously laid claim to Panama, the United States, and wider diasporic possibilities. Already in Jamaica, at least one such organization brought together recent migrants to share in dance, comedy, and politics. Through businesses like the Panama-based Agencias Giscom or Giscom Travel, Afro-Caribbean Panamanians also forged cultural and economic links between Panama, Jamaica, and New York. While not matching the scale and tenure of Las Servidoras, these organizations and businesses successfully tapped into the spirit of innovation and invention that long guided Afro-Caribbean diasporic world-making. By 1971, a branch of Las Servidoras began operating in Panama, and along with its parent branch in Brooklyn, adopted a new name, the Dedicators. The change is explained by past members of the organization, who coincided with seeking a name that would make the group more accessible within the New York City area. Just as this name change came into effect, the group had an opportunity to expand its reach to Panama. A group of women and men there, including former New York residents who were inspired by the work of Las Servidoras / the Dedicators, requested permission to establish a new branch of the organization. Black students would remain the focus, centering on the needs of students in Panama. Unlike the Brooklyn-based group, men would also serve in elected positions. By 1974, the Panama branch counted 11 members and offered 2 scholarships that year to Panama City-based students, bringing a total distribution by the Dedicators to 14. Las Servidoras, the Dedicators, thrived as an organization after its humble Brooklyn beginnings. Its history allows for a richer understanding of diaspora making by Afro-Caribbean Panamanians. A Brooklyn brownstone became the base for Las Servidoras, and the city as a whole became transformed by luncheons, dinner dances, cotillions, and scholarship awards coordinated by the organization. This event brought together a multilingual and multi-diasporic Black New York, but also revealed generational differences. These differences, like those back on the Isthmus, pose questions about self and community, identity, progress, and belonging. The work of Las Servidoras contended with gender inequities as they pertain to recognition, opportunities, and leadership platforms in Panama and the United States. Women were active agents on the Isthmus and used venues like newspapers, schoolrooms, beauty shops, churches, radio stations, and small independent businesses to share their opinions about the present and their visions for the future. This backdrop of action allowed for the emergence of Las Servidoras, rooted in the belief that women had the capacity to organize and serve a wider community. The honoring of Muslim men for some time typified the actions of the group, but with each event, a realization that Black women in Panama, New York, and the Caribbean shared points of commonality emerged, that few Afro-Caribbean women had ever been recognized for their work, and that young women continued to seek avenues for educational advancement, also registered into these events and scholarship decisions. Issues of class and propriety never disappeared from the equation, but in highlighting the work and intelligence of women, Las Servidoras, the Dedicators, challenged longstanding masculinist frameworks of community activism and diasporic world-making.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Duncan, would you like to engage Professor Corinealdi in conversation?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having me and for the privilege of participating in this discussion. I am, I would have to say, rather excited for this work and the implications that it poses. I'm also very, very, very happy about the detailed archival work that takes place here, because essentially what has happened is the actual efforts of the women to document themselves, to orchestrate their own story, to make sure that historians and others had an opportunity to get it right, is cataloged here. And so in many ways, they re-enter the historical narrative as scripters of their own identity, and then also as persons who allow us to put them in various contexts. One of the contexts that Professor Corinealdi posits here is one of the sort of veracity of ethnic identity amongst Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans, right? And so there are two types of juxtapositions or overturning of homogeny or homogeneous identity that's taking place in the narrative. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you would, to help us understand and explore some of the scenes as young people coming to the United States in the 50s and the 60s. And we're talking during the Civil Rights Movement, the emergence of Black Power, where you have Afro-Caribbean and African-American persons converging and melding and going to high school together, but then coming home to neighborhoods and to parents who are of a generation that says, we're of the same hand, but we are separate as the fingers on the hand. Professor Corinealdi.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because one of the things that I most enjoyed in putting this chapter together was getting that generational experience from people who, at the time I was interviewing them, they were already in, their 60s, some of their 70s, but they're remembering and recalling what it was like for them to have been teenagers when they arrived. And one of the things that really stood out was the way that, at least for their older relatives, there was this insistence on, we have to still maintain a separation, right? We're not all the same. And whether that is through the way that you live, the way that you speak, the languages you speak, et cetera, that is important. And this sort of generation that is raised in the 60s and 70s sort of being, that makes no sense. Like when I'm walking down the street, no one asks me, where are your parents from? Or were you born somewhere else? I am treated as any other Black person would be treated in Brooklyn at this point in time. So that's sort of being one thing, but also the realization that for some, making alliances and being really explicit about these organizations in some instances became easier to do, let's say, with African Americans, than sometimes members of the Latina community who just did not see them as such, right? And so becoming leaders of Black studies attempts at creating it at places like Brooklyn College, which had huge number of Black Panamanian students. And this is realization that campaigns for justice and struggle united this expansive notion of the Black diaspora that really in places like Brooklyn were brought to light in fantastic ways, for whether it was through language, culture, place of birth, experiences within New York that really demanded crossing some of the barriers or sort of hierarchies that older generations had put forth, with a sense of, we're actually in this together. Like one of the people that I sort of interview sort of beautifully phrases it, like sort of like, we're all Black in this together. And that sense of being one was really compelling to hear being reflected upon decades later.
Thank you so much for that. And, this idea of we're all Black in this together also comes out throughout the text, and particularly in chapter 5, where we see the Black press also recognizing some of these efforts. But the idea that the women not only come from a multidimensional and multi-ethnic background, but then we also see directly and indirectly their participation in multiple organizations, like they are choosing where and when they want to partner, how they want to be associated, and what they are signaling by how they choose to invest. Now, that being said, the organizations that they invest in and partner with do not necessarily speak to some of the more specific questions and concerns that they have as Black immigrants in the United States, or more specifically, Black immigrants in New York. Case in point, joining the NAACP, right? Can you sort of help us understand, are these partnerships and alignments exclusively strategic and deliberate, or is there some form of reciprocity that is expected or actually takes place as they align themselves with churches in Brooklyn, with other social justice organizations, and even with other social fraternal organizations, which some of the women come to be a part of later on?
Yeah, so one of the things that became apparent in looking at their decisions of who to align with as servidoras was that there were really no groups that had emerged looking at assisting Black immigrants. Like, the idea of Black people as immigrants was still, for many, something that had not been fully developed and explored. And so one of the things that I see the women in deciding to, for example, join and support the NAACP doing is this understanding that an ethos for equal education is something that they can, in fact, be a part of and are happy to be a part of, but also an understanding that those particular spaces, whether it's the NAACP or particular organizations in New York, et cetera, are also not going to be able to fully dive into their own unique histories, which is why it becomes so important for them to still hold these like annual, biannual events that are really centering on this is who we are. I focus, for example, on their commemorative journals, because they really become a way to sort of highlight, well, how are they presenting themselves to a wider state and at times international community that is assessing them, that isn't always seeing the layers they're in. You know, I found that it was really interesting that when you had the New York Amsterdam News, for example, cover the group, they would focus on, well, Shirley Chisholm was there, right? And she had some great things to say, and not necessarily what the group was doing, it was about. And then with the Panama Tribune, which is a Panama-based newspaper, you know, they might have a bit of more context and fluency in terms of what was presented there, but that was intentional in that an actual secretary of the group, right, the elected secretary, went and provided this information to the Tribune. It's like, this is what I want you to say about how we were founded, what we're doing, what we expect people to see about our work. And then really thinking about their decisions of who to give these scholarships to, also being another really important thing. You know, the fact that they're looking at young women that are thinking about international affairs and are really thinking about being part of a larger Black international community is fascinating. In addition to women who are also very focused on how might they give back through social work, et cetera. So people that might not have been envisioned as sort of centering and leading these developments because, you know, they might not have had some of the inner workings of connections to the NAACP or churches, but that these particular organizational leaders saw as like, these women are the future, right? They are actually going to provide the kind of sources that, for example, recognizes we need to have spaces where people who are Black immigrants to the United States can receive the kind of care and necessity that we need. And these conversations that are happening just as we have that shift post 1965 with the change in laws that also really expands this in quite a way, but they're thinking about this even prior to this, right? How can you center what it means to be a person in the world, but also someone who's a migrant and has had to face the challenges that comes with that at various levels.
Thank you for that. And I want us to take a step back there in terms of the challenges that you say are faced on various levels, because there's a flux in citizenship status for these women, right? And men. And it all depends on when they chose to travel, when they were born, who can prove who was whose mother, and the impact of the Canal Zone political culture, geographic and topographical makeup really comes to bear, I think, in how you lay out why they make these choices. For example, to have a Spanish name but run meetings in English, to identify as Afro-Caribbean, to take the name Black, period, full stop, as opposed to some other constructions that we hear coming from other Caribbean islands, and avoiding to some extent, this idea of being mixed race or mixed heritage, right? And so this fluidity in citizenship seems to affect their practice of citizenship, their exercise or construction of citizenship. First and foremost, the organization has as its main public objective, and we'll talk about some of the other things that it does that, kind of give away other truths. But its public objective is to fill a gap that the government in Panama and ultimately the United States government fails to live up to a duty of equality in terms of opportunity and access to education, to employment, and to protections, all right? Because part of what these women are doing on some level is providing protections for themselves, for their relatives, and for the extended community that comes to the New York City area. I would like to ask you, these changes in citizenship, these fluidities in citizenship, no matter what, who's president at what point, either in 41 or 49 or 52, these women seem to hold on to this, I am Panamanian, regardless of whether or not the Constitution says that they are. How do you account for that? How do we ferret that out for the reader, for our students? How do we explain this other kind of nationalism that has nothing to do with the way the nation views itself or defines itself?
Yeah, that has come up a lot, right? Like, what? How can you say that you're Panamanian and your nation is like literally taking away your citizenship? But let me backtrack a little bit, because thank you so much for reintroducing that question of citizenship that really grounds the entire book. This question of, who gets to decide if you are a citizen of a nation, and the way that we are reminded that laws are written by people that have particular agendas at particular junctures. And so for the women who make their way to Brooklyn, it really depends in terms of the time of their departure, whether or not they had to prove that they had fully integrated into Panamanian culture to be able to receive an identity card, and then after that, a passport. So imagine, having to essentially verify that though you were born in a place, you had fulfilled these very vague criterias of showcasing that you have been fully incorporated into the country. And as I outline in the book, this directly drew from a constitutional amendment that called out Black Panamanians of Caribbean ancestry as being unqualified to be Panamanian citizens. And so this is the specter, right, of having had their citizenship regulated in one way or another and then denied fully in the 40s, that the women that come to New York, this is constantly undermined. One of the women that joins Las Servidoras, I was able to find a letter that she wrote to the president of Panama, petitioning her right to be a citizen based on her birth. And when I saw that this was the same woman that I was writing about in Las Servidoras, I was just on the one hand floored that like she made it, right? Because like you just see these papers and you don't know what happens after that point in time, but also deeply concerned that this was a process that people had to go through, period, right? Full stop. And that kind of indignity of having had to prove that you were a citizen of this place where you were born is why, for me, the women of Las Servidoras are so adamant in like, I'm Panamanian, and guess what? I'm also becoming a US citizen, right? Like I loved how they were messing with this notion of a very fixed and neat, and we get to decide from the top down who was going to be Panamanian. And it really came from lessons they had learned from their own parents, grandparents, who saw that the state could be so fickle in its decisions as to whether or not it would grant you citizenship, but that you had to nonetheless maneuver and find ways to self-identify and promote yourself in the world, even as you then had to try to petition by writing letters or going through the citizenship and naturalization process in another country to get to practice those rights of citizenship. So that idea of we've always had to prove in one way or another that we're Panamanian, and rejecting that notion and saying, actually, I get to be Panamanian in New York. And I get to be Panamanian because you tried to deny this right of my ancestors, for me was sort of the really powerful sort of core that was basing the work of Las Servidoras.
So getting to be Panamanian in New York, but still not fully enjoying the label in Panama itself at various points. I want to ask you just to, extrapolate with me for a moment. What implications do you see from this part of the history, this part of the narrative, for places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic in the current moment?
Yeah, in writing this, it just struck me that denationalization was a thing happening in the 21st century, right? I was writing about it in the 1940s, with really attempts already starting in the 20s to decide who could and could not. And what I think this for me is a reminder of is that we need to continue to have conversations across the diaspora, right? Across the hemisphere about the ways that anti-Blackness continues to operate in the world, right? The fact that these legislations, and when you have seen constitutional level attempts at taking away rights, have been centered at Black men, women, and their children, is a reminder of just how convinced many of the elites, right, in spaces of Panama and the Dominican Republic have been in suggesting that this narrative, these fictions that they have developed about who should be in the nation should now be implemented into law. And so what I see in the young people right now in the Dominican Republic, and people like Sonia Pierre, who were leading these efforts as well at denouncing it, is a recognition of this full scale of humanity that they have always seen and always viewed as having a shared commonality with. And I would just say, well, now with this history, we now see that we're actually people who had to think about that robustness of humanity, going back to the 40s and into the 60s, where you indeed had state officials trying to take it away. And so I would, ask us to, as we're seeing these policies, and I suspect we're not going to be the last ones that we see emerging in the Americas, to remember that this is kind of an old book that they are referencing, an old book of anti-Blackness, one that is intended to separate, to divide, to have Black communities at each other, rather than in conversation and dialogue. And so I hope that the book can be the beginning of a dialogue across spaces of Black diasporic living in the Americas and beyond.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Corinealdi. And, one of the hopes that I also have for the work is, a point that you make subtly, boldly throughout, about women who determine for themselves independently, not as a reaction to any kind of, patriarchal oppression in any way, shape, or form, but that the Alpha Club, as it started, was designed by women specifically because they had a particular intention. It was not born of any contestation between genders or in response to a male organization that wasn't allowing them to have a voice or have a say, but that they then evolve into what they consider to be a service organization, but it's not so much just service for themselves, service for their immediate family, service for the immediate community or diasporic community, but then that this turns into a service for Brooklyn on a much larger scale. And, the Panamanian Day here that we have that precedes Labor Day, the Saturday before Labor Day, is actually an extension of the work that they began. And using the cotillion space as an education space, and then reclaiming what happens in the siesta format, re-scripting the folklore and the folk dance in ways that allow for color to appear as a part of the story, the narrative, and the ownership. I think, on some level, when we hear the name of the organization, when we read that it's a group of women, there's a number of assumptions that come with that your work dispels, right? Because we're looking at, by their own standards, educated, working class, low to middle income Black women who are now saying, we're looking for home ownership, we're looking for educational opportunity, we're looking to also then reinvest in Panama by extension. And so I find that is also an important contribution in terms of helping us understand their form of identity politics was not limited to the responses of limitations placed when they came to the US as immigrants, nor was it exclusively about limitations that they experienced in Panama itself. And so melding and seeing those kinds of parallels then help us to, I guess, begin to better understand what we mean by diasporic or transnational experiences and how those experiences inform leadership and activism across the board in terms of time and space, and the ways in which they ensured their progeny also becomes apparent as we trace the ways in which they deliberately script their narrative. And so I thank you so much for this work and for having me to share the space. I realize that I'm stealing some time here. I apologize, Professor Lewis, but thank you so much, Professor Corinealdi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, no apologies. This was a wonderful conversation. I do have one quick question as we wait, perhaps for other audience members to gather their thoughts. And this is kind of piggybacking on much of what Professor Duncan just said. But how would one begin to trace the legacies of the women who are in their 80s now, whom you interviewed, the legacies of their work, particularly across class in the New York area today?
Yes, well, I find that one of the things that I do is by seeing if some of the organizations that they created are still around. So for example, for Marsha Bain Smith, that Caribbean Health Center was one that I actually remember walking and sort of crossing across and not realizing that there was this really rich history behind it all, right? And this was a space that was explicitly created for poor, working women who were having such horrendous experiences in the social work realm in terms of people not understanding their livelihoods, their experiences, etc. Right, so that would be kind of one way that you can see it in Brooklyn. And then, Professor Duncan noted, of course, the Panamanian Day Parade is another instance in which you actually have the borough transformed. And in this case, really seeing both honoring of people who have provided businesses and educational centers, et cetera, but also that very dawning of particular items that were considered part of Panamanian folklore that only a select group got to wear. When you see people in parade in New York, it is the Black woman wearing a pollera, it is the Black man wearing a montuno, and that notion of that kind of white Iberian Panama is completely torn asunder, and anyone can participate in that, right? Anyone can decide that they want to join in those conversations and partaking in it as well. You also see it in the teachers, right? And this has been the thing, so many of the recipients, but also people who knew of the organization that I interviewed in other spaces, they themselves went on to teach and have this long legacy of students who could point to them as crucial interveners in helping them grow and develop their skills. And this really was across various groups, right? So not just like young Afro-Panamanians, but you found that these were the key leaders in places like Queens College, right, with people creating Latino Studies program and it being an Afro-Panamanian educator, and Brooklyn College, it also being an Afro-Panamanian educator who was doing Black studies. And so really thinking about their insistence in spaces that were intended to be public, that were intended to provide education for all. And their sort of focus and leadership there for me is also a sort of evidence of that really engaged understanding of the power of education to transform across class and time and generation.
Thank you. What an inspiring answer.
Oh.
I think one of our current fellows, Regan, has a question or comment.
Oh,
Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk and conversation. My question was just around, I guess, your research methods, because it seems like you're using various methods. It sounded like maybe interviews and oral histories, and then Professor Duncan mentioned these archival materials where the women were sort of documenting themselves and kind of bringing visibility to themselves. And so I was just wondering about, I don't know, how you went about kind of finding this information. Was it difficult and challenging? Because I've talked to other people about this kind of research, and they've talked about the difficulty sometimes of locating usually like Black women in the archive. So I was just wondering about that archival process that you had. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And for this chapter in particular, it was a mixture of oral histories, getting access to some of the materials that the nieces of the founder had kept. Also, this was one of the instances where the Schomburg Library proved also really helpful in terms of the records of an Afro-Panamanian leader actually had like a folder on the group. And I just sort of like dived a bit further and realized I could write so much more about them. And once I was able to actually connect with the nieces of the founder and also look at the way that various newspapers had written about it, it really kind of became this unique opportunity for me to do some of that kind of multi-pronged research that we always hope that we can do, right? That you can connect, getting to hear from people themselves, getting to see how others are writing about them, getting to see how others remember them and what they remember about them in this distinct way. And I really credit just the generosity of like my elders deciding to talk to me because I don't think this chapter would have really been possible if they did not, give me a chance. When I was like, I have these thoughts, and they were like, okay, what is it? And part of it had to do precisely with seeing me as part of this longer continuum of the educational dreams and aspirations of those that came before them. And so that that willingness to speak to me really just allowed me to then combine it with what I was finding in private and public archives as well.
Thank you, Professor Duncan.
Yes, just very quickly, I want to commend Professor Corinealdi in terms of the sources, because one of the things that happens in this text that usually transnational histories fall down on is she gave equal time to the newspapers in the United States, not only national Black newspapers, but local Black newspapers, and then newspapers from the diaspora also factored in. And so you get this multi-layered sort of tennis match. So the Amsterdam News reported it this way, then the Panama Tribune reported it this way. But meanwhile, back in Jamaica, the Gleaner actually carried this little footnote. And so she continuously reinforces the multi-dimensions of the group by going through the sources in this way and sort of saluting the ancestry of the persons that she's doing the oral history with. And I think that that's really important, that you have, not only you have the corroboration of the oral histories with the written material that they produced, but then also the idea that, for example, the different embassies, the Panamanian embassy, the Jamaica embassy in New York, also kind of get on board with the organization, because now this organization is doing something that, you know, really helps them bridge their indigenous population and the migrant population or the immigrant population in New York. And so they also become tied in and vested in seeing La Soledad blossom, right? Because this now becomes a way for them to have another feather in the cap. And it also helps them neutralize some of this contention amongst people from the diaspora when they come to New York and they want to form these little island-specific enclaves or island-specific associations. This then helps to sort of give a space or a moment of some level of unity and incorporation. And so that's why the archival work here does so much more than just provide us with, and here are the sources, or here is who said what, but you actually see the multi-layered conversation and then the sort of outgrowth or the legacies or importance of it beyond the women and the organizational space itself.
Thank you. And with that, may I suggest that we all get the book?
And like I said, I think there's a link in the chat. Right now it's 50% off from Duke, because they're having a sale for the fall. So if you haven't as yet procured a copy or just want another one to, to gift or to have, this is a good time. I think it ends this Friday in terms of that kind of like 50% off the paperback.
So we have a few days. Thank you so much for the wonderful book, and thank you so much for this stimulating conversation.
Thank you for having me.